This podcast is over, or podcast video cast is over chapter Foreign Banks, and I just want to give you a quick summary of that chapter. The purpose of it is to give you a map for going about and working with staff and other teachers in your school, so that when you do a curriculum unit of some sort dealing with multicultural, and I want to emphasize multicultural is not something you stop and do it for a month and then you never touch it again. That's called, I have a book here that actually is about that. It's quite good. It's called Beyond Heroes and Holidays. Okay. Which means we're going to have a Cinco de Mayo, and then we're going to have Kwanzaa, and as I was saying, Beyond Heroes and Holidays is a book that you can get. It's from the Center for Language Minority Education. I'm sure it's not free, but it has a lot of good stories about what is true and what is not true. And it calls them myths. I don't like the term myth. I just prefer the word lie. For instance, here's one on Arab stereotypes. And this is a great book. You probably can get it in your library. It's good to read. Even has a chapter on activism in preschool children. It probably scares you to think about the word activism with kindergarten or before kindergarten kids. Poems about refugees. Here's one about the internment of the Japanese in the 1940s. But this is a very good source book for ideas for multicultural education. And, you need to educate yourself. I mean, you can't just run out and spout the word multicultural education. And if you don't have a clear idea of what you might want to address, I do want to emphasize being very factual and very accurate in everything you present to the students. You don't want to present stuff that can be disputed. So you want to be fact-based, but as I'll talk about in just a moment, you can't avoid some controversy. You just have to decide how deep in multicultural you're going to go. And I always think that what they give here is they talk in this chapter. Banks suggests that you have organize your curriculum by getting some general concept. And one of those, they give an example, which happens to be one I would do if I were doing a multicultural unit. And I wanted to involve somebody other than just the history teacher. Let's say you wanted to get the music teacher and the history teacher, at least those two. Maybe you want to add a science teacher or something, but at least with the music, you could talk about the music of the Depression in 1930s and some of the songs, some of the issues that came out, and a lot of a tradition of kind of I wouldn't call them troubadours because it wasn't romance, but traveling singers, guitar players. Some of this kind of related to country music too. Woody Guthrie was a big one during the 30s. A lot of these people later were associated with communism when there was this big fear of communism, and any kind of movement to allow unions or to defend the rights of workers was attacked as an attack on capitalism. So, if you objected to the low wages and you objected to the way you're treated on your job and you tried to organize or complain about it, then people would say you're a communist and therefore we can fire you and run you out of town. You have no credibility. It's as old as mankind. Whenever two people are in conflict, you want to totally destroy their reputation so they're not able to to do anything, or they get stuck with that. We see that now, and if you haven't seen it now, then you haven't been awake the last 20 years. But that's the way it works. I won't go into the current right now. But the one about all people move for better economic, political, and social opportunities, that's a concept that on the surface of it, who could argue with that? People move because they want better jobs. Who are those people that move, though? And of course, our lauded ancestors from Europe came here for religious freedom, for a better life. The Puritans weren't exactly living the high life in England, and some of those people that broke away from them, they were more independent, that there wasn't much tolerance. The Catholic Church had been overtaken in England, and then it was suppressed. It was a battle over who's going to suppress who, but then when the Anglican Church, Church of England, became the official church, it became important for you to be a member of that church to advance socially. Catholics basically didn't have anywhere to go in England. Also Jews. There was a Jewish prime minister of England, Disraeli, in the year 1860s, 70s, and 80s. It is very rare, but it was possible, but it was difficult. Now, so we have the general concept about moving for better life for different reasons. And I could think of some very negative examples when I was just reading this, and I was thinking about stuff I know of. Of course, the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, when Andrew Jackson, the guy on the $20 bill, basically over this objections of the Supreme Court, which ruled against him, ignored the Supreme Court and forced the 5 tribes from the Carolinas and Florida. This included Seminole, Cherokee, and 3 other tribes, which I don't recall right offhand. They were forced to move to Oklahoma in the 1830s. The Japanese internment at the beginning of World War II, they didn't intern Germans or Italians because that would have got over half the country would have been in jail or in internment camps. The Ponca, I mentioned that. I was just thinking, and people in Nebraska, and I've been reading your papers. I'm almost finished with your local papers, and there's been a lot of stories about different tribes being forced to move to Oklahoma. The Ponca were some of those tribes in the southeastern part of Nebraska. And then the term, I wanted to just bring these up again, acceptance of values versus power, which is cultural assimilation, which a lot of people will endorse the same products. They'll have the same religion, the same values. Concept of family may be the same, but because of the color of their skin or maybe their religion or something like that, they don't have what's called structural assimilation, which really is power. That means, do you get in the structure? Can an African-American man become mayor of the town? I know some of you will argue, well, sure, they get the most votes. Well, that's true. But can they get the most votes? So you see certain groups are not becoming powerful, and similar people are reelected all the time to office. So in terms of institution, the same thing with women. How many women legislators are there compared to men? How much more difficult is it for them? There are always exceptions. So we're talking about general rules here. And then he mentions how they retain some ethnic institutions. I'm thinking African-American culture. The Black church is a powerful institution, far more powerful than the church, I would argue, in other groups. whether they're different groups in the white culture or it's a different perception of what the institution is. Institution of sports. That's where we have for many years, we had cultural assimilation. You had a lot of different groups participating in football. But I remember this actually happened. A former vice president, or was vice president of the Los Angeles Dodgers, was asked on television whether or not African Americans can be managers or football coaches. And he actually made the statement that they really just don't have the capacity to do that, more or less said that. And of course, he was immediately fired. He apologized. But the fact is that the number of coaches of color was very, very limited for a long time. And baseball's very slow to change. Took a long time to get Hispanic managers. And yes, you can always find an exception, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, when you have 60% of the players are one group or one ethnic group or linguistic group, but, there's not one of them represented in the coaching ranks. That's very peculiar. So that's an example of acceptance of cultural assimilation took place, but the structural assimilation did not. Okay, you work your way down to other generalizations. And this is where the real risk is that, we have this generalization about people move for political, economic, and social opportunities. We can find tons of examples. African-American migration in northern cities in the early part of the 20th century. We've got books here on the Harlem Renaissance. We can talk about both documented and undocumented. Notice I don't use the word illegal, but undocumented workers coming to the United States to work and fulfilling a major part of the labor market, whether it was in meatpacking or any kind of tough jobs, And I can find that pattern with the Irish too. The Irish were brought over and did the same work, and there are examples of the Irish actually being murdered because people didn't want to pay them. So that back in the 1830s, there was actually a railroad where they think that this many young men apparently were shot and killed and not paid because there was a dispute. So what we have, I've got a cold, so I'm trying to keep my head up about me. So what do we have? We have a situation where we can always find exceptions, but we're looking for the general pattern, okay? So we have the generalization on the moving for economic benefits, but when you apply it to Mexicans coming to the United States over the last 40 years, although they came for 100 years off and on, you'll have people objecting, saying, no, they're here illegally, etc. Or I say undocumented. But it's the same type of behavior. Some people like to give the idea that everybody came to the United States with a visa in their hand, or at least a temporary visa, something like that. And that's not the facts of history. Law changed. People ignored it. A lot of times laws aren't enforced, or there are no laws. People just overlook it. Anyhow, I call this the red zone. When you get into the specifics and you have the generalization and you say, oh, your Irish ancestors came here. Your German ancestors came here. The Chinese came here to help on the railroad, but then they got kicked out again in the 1800s. There was a law passed, the Asia, I think it was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, specifically that people be forced out if they were of a certain ethnic group. This was a big issue with China and Japan around 120 years ago, because their governments objected to their people being mistreated. Okay. I call this the red zone. It's not for scoring, but it's for danger. Whenever you get into the specifics and you say, wow, how are the Irish different from the Mexicans now? Or how are the Jews that came here as refugees different from the Syrians that want to come here as refugees? Okay. Now we're talking about current issues of great anger and that's where, when you as a multicultural teacher, when you start touching on the present and the future, but especially the present or recent past, that's when you get people upset because they disagree. And you may have all the proof in the world. You may be on very solid ground, but community pressure or a few angry people can make it very difficult for a teacher. Teachers are not known. I regret sometimes how teachers are portrayed, or certainly how people see teachers, and they don't always show absolute reverence. I don't think I'm telling you anything new, but parents can be quick to blame the teacher, and over issues like this, sometimes they can really go to Facebook and do all kinds of horrible things. If one teacher misbehaves in some way and does something awful, then they may use that, try to attack you as a teacher. And so my cautionary tale to you here is that when you go into this, don't go in very idealistic and say, I'm going to be a social activist as a teacher. On the other hand, don't go and say, I'm just going to keep quiet because I don't want to bring up anything too controversial. You may choose to do that, but I think you have to approach these issues. Excuse me. It's not Perrier, it's just water. I like to look French. Okay, now, so when you put together your unit, you have to think very carefully about the examples you're going to use. I'm one of those people that believes you can approach controversy, but you don't grab it and you don't run out in front of the running of the bulls and dare it to run a horn through you or something. So there are ways to prepare yourself, I would say protect yourself, and that is by finding comparisons that people very empathetic with. One thing I really enjoyed, we had a two-day workshop here at UNK about 3 years ago, and it was on this is from Virginia. I have to remember where I got all this stuff. But the center, and I will send this to you because I have to look it up. But we had a 2-day presentation on the Holocaust. And it talked, and we had a Holocaust survivor talk to us. I got a lot of great books and materials. One thing you know about the Holocaust is that you have very few Americans of any merit, and I don't think there could be any, who would deny the Holocaust. But, in Europe, you can actually be arrested for denying the Holocaust. That's actually a crime. They don't have freedom of speech. You can just say anything you want. So I like their materials. This one's great, The Hidden Children of the Holocaust. And it's got all kinds of books. It's Saddleback Publishing Company. And it's books on the Holocaust. And this one talks about first-person accounts of teenagers that survived the Holocaust. And maybe in some cases didn't survive. But it tells how they survived, and the horrible example of the Holocaust presents us with an opportunity to examine our own values. And this term, you may have heard of it. If you haven't, it's like anathema to certain groups. Values clarification, like you're trying to pervert or ruin someone's values by presenting historical events. There's history, and then there's if you remember that there's a show on TV where they call it Drunken History on the Comedy Network. And a person's drunk and they tell the history of the Gettysburg Address or the surrender at Appomattox or the invention of the light bulb. And I guess these people are drunk. I've only seen it a couple of times, but the idea is supposed to be funny. They just make it up as they go. And that's kind of how people have certain perceptions. People, for the most part, love Abraham Lincoln. What I know, really interesting little story. Abraham Lincoln, a guy once wrote, and I think that was Mark Twain, but it could have been somebody else. He said, if you want to write a book that is an absolute bestseller, this was in the 19th century, he said, well, everybody loves Abraham Lincoln. And everybody likes books about little boys. And everybody loves books about doctors because doctors help people. So that's a winner. So he figured it out, and he says, and they like dog stories. He said, so write a book about Lincoln's doctor's son's dog. And he said, everybody will like it. It's got Lincoln, it's got a doctor, it's got a little boy, and it's got a dog. And who could turn down that story? And it was a joke, but it was pretty true. You have to have an empathetic character for people to. And so, you know that in the history of the Holocaust that there were ships, and I think one was USS St. Louis, was a ship, not USS, but it was a ship called, I think, the St. Louis, that had a large number of Jews on it that tried to dock in Cuba, and the United States would not allow it to, and they were forced to go back to Europe, and many of those people died in the Holocaust. Nowadays, people wouldn't think twice about it. They say, oh my gosh, we're saving them. But many people didn't believe the Holocaust until our own troops captured those camps and showed the horrors of the Holocaust. And still there are people that try to downplay it. Anyhow, no one's going to argue with that. That's a real solid thing. If anybody argues about the Holocaust, then you probably got them there because they can't come off credible saying that. That's what I like to do, is I like to find things I can depend on, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and if you deny that, most people are going to agree with you. Unfortunately, you're depending on the fact that most people know this or will embrace this particular information. The reason that this group did this education on the Holocaust was to keep people, is not let the infamy and the evil fade away from the memory of civilization. Sadly, people connect the Holocaust to Europe. Now, I don't call it Holocaust, but there are other genocidal activities. Rwanda in the 1990s was a terrible war against, if you've ever seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, that's a great movie. Came out a few years ago. And it shows one tribe literally taking machetes and killing off people from the other tribe. Incited by people on the radio just going mad. It almost is like a zombie thing. You know, only they weren't killing zombies, they were killing innocent people with machetes. It was horrible. Right now in Myanmar, the Rohingya were a Muslim minority in the country of Myanmar, which is in the old days was Siam or Burma. They are being treated horribly, and there's rapes, murders, executions, and they're trying to escape into Bangladesh. People have almost nothing. They lost everything. They didn't have much, but then they lost that. And the military of Myanmar are just systematically wiping them out. We have Karen people, the Karen, I think I'm saying that right, from Myanmar, from the other part of Myanmar. They went into Thailand, and many of them are in the Omaha, Lincoln area. I've read about them. Some of you talked about them. But the Rohingya, I don't know if they'll ever get here because they're Muslims. So there's already a strike against them because of their religion. that they won't be allowed. And then we've also got this restrictions on refugees from certain countries, and religion has a lot to do with it. I don't want to do a political thing right now, but you know. Okay. Teaching Tolerance, which is a book. This one's called Us and Them. Something off my screen. Us and Them. The story of some Americans who were hated by others simply for who they were and what they looked like or what they believed. And so it's got Hispanics, Jews, Chinese, and it's a wonderful for a history class. And it's called Us and Them. And you may be able to get this for free. It's from Teaching Tolerance. It's a funded group. And I think it's from the a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Southern Poverty Law Center has been very active identifying hate groups, starting mainly with the KKK, but now expanded to anybody that hates anybody and is after them for their religion or whatever, ethnicity, etc. Okay, now I got some really cool books, and I'm going to show you this one first. I bought this a few years ago. It's called The Holocaust Chronicle. I bought it in a bookstore. It was on sale, and it was pretty cheap. But I like it because they maintain documents. This thing is an encyclopedia. It's terrible to look at. It's not like nudity or anything. It's just the cruelty. It talks about the history of how they gradually persecuted Jews in Germany, and also other groups too, but mainly the Jews, and the others were picked up as if you were gay, if you were Jehovah's Witness, if you were a gypsy. They had a whole list of unacceptable people, and they all ended up in concentration camps. Yeah, sometimes when you teach this, you don't want to live on it. These are not books that I love to look at. I have to look at them. This one, The African American Archive, great book. You can buy this stuff cheap on. This one deals with documents, and it actually has everything from poetry to letters, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Abraham Lincoln, all kinds of things here. Talks about the history when African Americans first arrived. They came in chains. Some people conveniently act like somebody immigrated from Africa because they wanted to work in cotton fields or in the tobacco business. They just kind of overlooked that. And I will send you, I'm going to make you a list of some of this stuff. I got some free books. When you see something and you see a pile of children's shoes from children that were murdered in a concentration camp, this picture here shows hairbrushes that were taken from people that were murdered. Anyhow, the Hitler Youth, Witnesses to Holocaust. The goal here is not to depress your students, but to show them that some of the untruths, the lies, it's just lies. Some of this stuff spread around even right now, and what's going on the internet, is anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-gay, and it's done in a way that destroys the reputation of someone who tries to defend or get involved. It's right now, it's probably more concentrated than it could ever be before. I'm trying not to use any politics here, but I'm trying to keep this keep this, that you do look at hatred, and that's what we're talking about. We're not teaching tolerance in the sense that you need to be nicer to people or some nonsense like that. We're talking about identifying lies when you see them. And some people, people can have an honest disagreement about particular viewpoints in politics, like tax policy, etc. But the Southern Poverty Center, Law Center, they have magazines that come out. They keep track of. I wouldn't say they always come out with the exact, but they give a lot of evidence trying to keep track of hate groups. And you'll be shocked where you see they are located. Now, there may not be very many people. I don't know about you. If I find there's 2 Nazis in my town, that's too many. I want to know if there's somebody that's that fanatical that endorses violence against people. And the same goes, the hate groups, by the way. Hate groups identify can also be leftist groups. They can be groups that want to empower other minorities but want to do it with violence. So it's not all just one particular group. That's another important thing. But I will caution you, and just to put this in perspective, that you can't just run out and make a bunch of wild statements and you have to be careful to gauge the temperature of your community and what you want to do. So when you go through this and you talk about, and I mentioned a minute ago, you work your way from the generalization, the big one, people move for political or economic benefits. And then you go down and you start looking at specific things. You might start out looking at the beauties of the cultures that have moved. For instance, what have African Americans endowed to our culture, to our country's culture? A lot of people say jazz music, gospel music, some poetry, things like that, food, And so what you try to do is you go through more, I would say more, I don't want to say the word safe, but I mean more familiar and non-threatening contributions. But and while the term teaching tolerance is used, I don't want to just tolerate people. I want to interact with them, and I want them to be a part of this culture in a healthy way. So if the person coming in, if you have a student in your class that's pretty right wing, or for that matter, they could be left wing. I mean, if they're just an absolutist ideologue or something like that, I don't know if that's ever going to happen with you. But I think you try to find, as much as possible, you try to give every human being in your school a lot of leeway so that they can become engaged and they can explore other cultures and see what's good about them. Because the good is huge and the negative is a matter of communicating. Well, I hope this makes a little sense. I can't just give you a direct, but I don't want to just, in this course, I don't want to just paper this over and say, well, if you follow this Banks diagram here, it's all going to work out great. You have to look at who you're working with and the staff, the other teachers. You want to make a unit. You want it to be a positive thing. You have to build with little victories. And you want to make sure they're victories. You don't start out engaging in a huge, like I talk to my students about English language learners, and they'll say, well, the school I'm at doesn't treat them very well. I could tell them, I said, you need to call a civil rights lawyer and bring them up on charges or get them to sue the school. I said, that's not going to work. Not that you can't do it, but that if I have a disagreement with my neighbor and the first time they find out about it is when they're served with papers, I don't think that we're ever going to build that relationship. Okay. Now, of course, if it's anything criminal or threatening in a serious way, that's different. You know, someone's threatening someone, bullies or etc. That's not something where you try to make them shake hands, which is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. Because if you have someone who's a real threat, you have to deal with them. You know, as I'm getting this head cold, I think I've said everything I need to say about this. That's why I wanted this chapter, this fourth chapter. It's not very long, but it's just a way of thinking how you want to craft. And you do craft these units. You don't just, you want to really control where stuff is going. You don't want to have hidden surprises. Okay. You don't want somebody at the school assembly to do something to upset the principal and blow it all up as a demonstration. Theoretically, that'd be perfectly fine, but you know in your school what people tolerate. And I always think it's best to immunize people in a way that they can accept greater and greater diversity and change. That's kind of a gradualist approach, mainly because I don't know your situations and I can't possibly speak to that. You have to be in your own skin, make that decision. Okay. Okay. Well, if you have any comments on this, you can email me. I don't think I've said anything too wild, but if I have, I'll probably catch hell. But I just think that we have to get edgy. We have to push. We have to push the envelope, or whatever that terrible metaphor is. We have to get a little bit into some feeling, not pretend everything in history was wonderful. I've heard people tell me that, you know, that a certain group was interned or enslaved or some horrible thing. But look at the positive side of it. And then they try to bring up some stupid excuse that, well, they didn't have to work for a living. You know, everything was provided for them. And I said, what do you mean they didn't have to work? They had no freedom. They were locked up or in chains. Or right now we have the whole issue of minorities being in prison, and some of that came out of Ferguson. It had nothing really to do with the shooting. I would say that it had to do with other things that were going on in the town. People getting fines and couldn't pay them. They owed more money. Then they had to borrow money to pay the fine. Then they had interest on the fine. And it got to be a cycle in which you'd think it was more racketeering. So, but you can look into that and see if that's the facts. Thank you. And now I end the meeting.